Here, you can just take them and pass them around. So good morning. My name is Dale Kuehne. I'm from Manchester, New Hampshire, and I'm really pleased to be here. I really appreciated worship yesterday. I really appreciated hearing your heart, hearing what you're about, and I'm glad to come to share a bit with you about who I am and what I'm about. I don't normally do this, but I'm going to do kind of an extended introduction of myself. I think it's important that you know who it is that you're connecting with and who's trying to teach you, etc. So I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I spent every waking minute of my childhood playing ice hockey. And when I came time to pick a college, I went to Wheaton College in Illinois, and I went to Wheaton and I played ice hockey. But they didn't have an ice hockey major. So I failed 2 courses my first 2 years of college. I failed a course my freshman year. I think it was a form of hazing. I went to hockey camp before school started, and one of the upperclassmen took me aside and asked me what I was taking. And so I told him. And among the courses I was taking was biology for non-majors. And he said, you know, you're going to college. You should challenge yourself. You should take biology for majors. So I changed my course into biology for majors, and when I got to the midterm, I realized that we really had to memorize the Latin names for every part of a flower, which I hadn't done, and so I failed the midterm, and I couldn't catch up, and so I ended up failing the course. And then my sophomore year, in the spring, the weather got nice, and I quit going to class. I didn't take the final in one of my classes, and my professor had the audacity to fail me. So if you get off to a slow start in your life, or you get off to a slow start in college, rest assured that your future isn't just defined by a few weeks of your life. And it's not defined by how you begin, but it's defined by how you end. And so I got 3 concussions in 2 weeks playing ice hockey when I was a junior, and so I ended up having to drop out of college. And the person that drove me from Wheaton, Illinois to Minneapolis, Minnesota was Rachel Gustafson, and Rachel ended up becoming my wife. And so that was kind of our first date. Not that I remember much from that trip because of all the concussions I'd had, but I transferred to the University of Minnesota that fall, and so I started at the University of Minnesota, and I went out for the ice hockey team, and I didn't make varsity, but I made junior varsity. And so in 1979 and 1980, I played ice hockey at the University of Minnesota in the junior varsity, not the varsity. Our varsity coach was a guy named Herb Brooks, who some of you may have heard of. He was the coach of the 1980 Miracle on Ice Olympic hockey team, and 6 of our players played on that team. So it was a really cool experience. My only interaction with Herb or the varsity was during practice. They brought the junior varsity goalies out to be cannon fodder for the varsity hockey team, and but it was a cool experience nonetheless. And I got married when I was a junior. So Rachel graduated from Wheaton in the spring of 1980, and we got married in August of 1980. And we ended up moving out to Minnesota, where I finished. It took me 5.5 years to do my 4-year undergraduate degree, but I ended up doing it. And after I got married, I got straight A's. So I tell students that if you're having difficulties in life, getting married is a great idea. It worked for me. And I decided I wanted to integrate politics. I wanted to study politics and Christianity. And I decided I didn't want to study politics at a seminary, and I didn't want to study religion at a graduate school of politics. So I decided to integrate on my own, and I went to Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. And I got a master's degree in church history. And it took me 3 years to do that 2-year degree. And then I went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where I got a PhD in political theory with minors in American government and comparative politics. And while we were at seminary and at Georgetown, we had our 3 kids, Naomi, Leah, and Ryan. Naomi is a city manager in Blaine, Washington. Leah is an artist who lives in Rumney, New Hampshire. And my youngest, Ryan, is a lawyer for the Social Security Administration. He and his wife and our 2 grandkids live in Salem, New Hampshire. So, my wife didn't come with me on this trip because she's babysitting our grandkids. And she told me early on that when grandkids show up, I shouldn't expect to see her much. And that's been true. So, so after I graduated from Georgetown, because we had 3 kids, I needed a job, and I hadn't done my dissertation yet. So I took a job at William Jewell College in Liberty, Missouri, which was a Southern Baptist college. And I taught there for 5 years, and I loved it there. And while I was there, I finished my dissertation, and when I went to graduation, they stood us in a line according to alphabetical order. So my last name is K.U., and the guy behind me was Paul Manuel, M.A. And Paul was a fellow classmate at Georgetown, and he was the department chair at St. Anselm College. And we got to talking, and he said, "We've got an opening at St. A's. Do you want to apply for it?" So I said, "Sure," because I knew that New Hampshire was one of the first in the nation primary state. So I knew it'd be a cool place to do politics. And we wanted to live near one set of grandparents, and Kansas City wasn't really close to Minneapolis. And it certainly wasn't close to Haverhill, Massachusetts, where my wife is from. So we made the move. I applied and I got accepted. St. Anselm is a Catholic school. It's a Benedictine college. The Benedictines have been around. St. Benedict was the founder of the first monastic order in the 300s. And so the Benedictines have been around for a long, long time. And when I came for my interview, I told the dean of the college that I'd be happy to speak in chapel, because in the evangelical subculture where I come from, if you're a college professor and you believe in God and you can preach, you're gold. But when I told that to the Father Peter, he said, "Well, that won't be necessary." And I realized at that point that the interview was going sideways, but I didn't understand why. And when we got to the interview, he looked at me and he said, "I don't know whether we're going to hire you or not, but you need to know that if you come here, if anybody's going to change, it's going to be you." So they reopened the interview process. They brought in 3 more professors to interview, which is usually a sign that the first 3 professors weren't acceptable. But apparently those 3 professors had the audacity to question Father Peter about the Catholic Church's stand on abortion. And so I got a call in June, which was really late, and said, "Would you be willing to come to St. A's?" And I said, "Sure." So I've been there for the last 30 years. And when I got there in 1994, I got a phone call from Richard Gebhardt's chief of staff. And Richard Gebhardt was the Democratic Majority Leader from Missouri. And they said Richard Gebhardt was coming to New Hampshire. Would you be interested in having him speak at St. Anselm? And I replied, "Where have you been all my life?" Because when I was at William Jewell, we had tried in vain to get Richard Gebhardt to come speak, even though he was from Missouri. But in New Hampshire, they all come often. It's a small state that there's only 1 million people in it. And so there's not there's not a lot of places where you can actually go get a crowd. St. Ains happens to be one of them. And so we hosted nationally televised debates that cycle. And when it was done, the politics department got together and we said, this New Hampshire primary is a resource for the study of politics, and it seems like nobody in the state is taking advantage of it. Why don't we do it? And the three of us weren't from New Hampshire. And so we pitched a proposal to the administration, and the president of the college said, if you'll take it as one of your mission points to engage all 2,000 St. Anselm students as citizens, I'll support it. And so they did. And then I was named the founding director of the Institute of Politics. And they gave us a budget of $235,000. And they said, if you can make a self-sustaining Institute of Politics before the money runs out, you can have it. Otherwise, it's going to be a failed experiment. And shortly thereafter, Senator Judd Gregg came to St. Anselm, and I had lunch with him. And Senator Gregg made me feel like I was the only dumb person in the room. He proceeded to tell me what books he was reading, and he was just not he was not what I was all expecting in a senator. He was really cerebral. And so I told him about our idea for the Institute of Politics, and he really didn't say anything and he didn't react. But next week I got an email from his chief of staff saying, Senator Gregg wants you to send a proposal for money for the Institute of Politics. And so I said, how long do you want it? He said, just a page. So I spitballed a bunch of numbers. I put down that we wanted to have $12 million. And I got a call back from the chief of staff and said, you guys don't think cheap up there, do you? And I said, no. But I said, do you want me to revise the proposal? He said, no, that's okay. And so over the next 4 years, St. Anselm was written into the federal budget to receive $12 million. And we used that money to create a self-sustaining Institute of Politics. And so the Institute of Politics has been the one thing in my life that has turned out better than I imagined. And while I was in Missouri, the church that I was attending, I'm a member in the Evangelical Covenant Church. The church that I was attending, their pastor left. And I was the only person in the area that had gone to seminary and was in the Covenant Church. But I wasn't ordained. So they asked me, would I be the interim pastor there? And I said, sure. So I got to preach on Sundays, which I loved. And then I began to do other interim work around the area. And the denomination came to me and said, if you want to keep doing interim work, you need to be ordained. So I said, okay. So I went through the ordination process and I got ordained. And so that's where my foray into pastoral ministry started. And when I was in my second year at St. Anselm, I went in for my annual checkup, and the doctor felt around me and he said, what's this lump in your neck? And I said, what do you mean? I don't have a lump in my neck. And he says, sure you do, feel this. So I felt it, and it was the size of a golf ball. And I said to myself, geez, I'm really not very self-aware. And I was wondering why I had to get larger and larger necklines on my shirts. But so they did a biopsy. They found out I had papillary thyroid cancer. And so papillary thyroid cancer is usually dealt with pretty simply by taking a blast of radioactive iodine. So they put you in a lead-lined room in the hospital, and the nurse and the doctor come in spacesuits, and they give you this radiation pill, and you take it. And iodine automatically goes to all the thyroid tissue in your body, and so it irradiates it and kills it. But I had 3 reoccurrences over the next 2 years, and so they needed to do a surgery. And in the course of the surgery, I lost the use of one of my vocal cords, which is why I speak kind of raspily. And I also lost some saliva glands in my neck. And so that's one of the reasons I'm always drinking water. It's not for effect, and it's not to be cool. It's not for dramatic pause. It's simply because I need to. While I was at St. Anselm, I began teaching a course called The Politics of Diversity. It's the only course I ever designed from start to finish. It's a course that deals with the politically correct ideas of our age. It deals with the intelligence debate, the bell curve, whether intelligence is transmitted to us genetically or not. We did gender, we did marriage, and we did the issue of, we did male and female and gender, and then we did the transgender issue. And while I was doing that course, I felt led to write a book, and it became Sex in the I World, and it was for me my life work. And when I finished it, I was just simply exhausted. I ended up having a nervous breakdown, seriously. And it was probably because I realized that the stuff I was speaking about in that book was so politically incorrect. Because I don't support same-sex marriage. I don't support the transgender identity movement. And I believe gender matters. I believe male and female are made in the image of God, and they matter. And so I realized that that book was going to be really politically incorrect. And so I anticipated the blowback, and blowback I got. Because I was one of the few people willing to go speak to those issues, I was invited around the world. I was invited to South Africa. I was invited to Germany. I was invited to the UK. I was invited to Australia twice, Singapore twice, Hong Kong. I was invited out here to Hawaii. I spoke at several different Christian colleges in America. I spoke at the CCCU conference. I spoke at Q, where I met Rick. And in all those, in the places where I spoke in Europe, I was always protested. At the University of Bristol in England, students formed a ring around the building that prohibited people from entering the building. So I actually wasn't able to give the speech. And I'm basically a conflict-adverse person. So conflict makes me really uncomfortable. And so it was really, really difficult. And part of my background came up during this process of having this nervous breakdown. And my mom called me up one day, and I'm going to change the name of the person she's talking about. She said, "Have you heard about Jeff Smith?" And I said, "No, I hadn't heard about Jeff." And he said, "He jumped off a building. He tried to commit suicide." And I said, "Why?" And he said, because he claimed his pastor, Pastor Al Magnuson, abused him when he was a pastor of his church. And at that moment, I was brought back to my time at Covenant Pines Bible Camp in junior high school. And Pastor Al was our camp pastor, and he stayed in our cabin. And he put me in the bunk above him, and he abused me one afternoon. And so I told my mom, I said, "Yeah, Brent's telling the truth." And she said, "How do you know?" And I said, "Because it happened to me." And that was the first time that I had realized in all my life, I hadn't recalled that incident at all. So I just shoved out of my mind. So if you hear of sexual abuse survivors realizing only 30 or 40 years after the incident what happened, I can testify to the fact that it's real. And so that's been part of my journey as well. So when I got here, Rick asked me if I'd been writing lately, and the answer is I haven't. I've been trying to heal. And so being here with you is part of my healing because I feel like I'm in a safe space. I haven't told anybody this whole story except my wife. So you're the first group that I've ever felt comfortable to share it with. So I stand in front of you broken. I stand in front of you redeemed by Jesus. I stand in front of you washed in his blood. I stand in front of you in the healing process. And I stand in front of you wanting to share the ideas that I think are been the most important to me in terms of thinking about culture, thinking about the future. And so I'm going to take you on a journey here. And it may not be a journey that makes any sense right now. But I want to, it's going to be a journey with in the entire It's going to be a journey into the area of Christ and culture. And so, who is Christ? Who do we say that he is? Mm-hmm. Say that again. King of Kings. Say that again. Talked about his friend. He's talked about his judge.
He's bridegroom.
Mm-hmm.
The resurrection and the life.
So, is it possible to hold all of these things simultaneously? My experience is that Christian denominations emphasize one of these things to the exclusion of others. So legalistic denominations emphasize Jesus as judge. The Catholic Church emphasizes the sacrificial lamb. The Lutheran Church emphasizes Redeemer. The Methodist Church emphasizes Prince of Peace. The Jewish Church emphasizes Messiah. And so what I would say is that we need to become aware of how we view Jesus and how that can be, how our vision of Jesus can skew how we think about Jesus. And our culture ends up changing how we view Jesus. So when we think about culture, what do we think about?
Sex.
Say that again?
Sex.
Sex? Say it.
Culture. Sex. Yes. No.
Mhm.
Okay.
TV? Ah,
Politics. Depression.
say that again?
Depression.
TV? You and I are thinking along the same line.
That was.
So the question is, how should a Christian engage culture? Or shouldn't we engage culture? Yep, how would Christ have us choose to engage culture? Hmm. My grandfather was a missionary in northern Minnesota. He graduated from Moody Bible Institute in 1913, and he ended up going to work in northern Minnesota with a group called the American Sunday School Union. And that was an evangelistic mission at that time. And what he would do is he would go to communities where there was new immigrants that came in, and he would start a Sunday school, and a Sunday school would attract the kids. And the idea is that if you attract the kids and got them coming to Sunday school, the adults would end up following the kids, and they'd start a church. And my grandfather was probably one of the most influential people in my life. He was named Man of the Year in St. Louis County, Minnesota for 5 straight years in the 1950s. He was somebody who, if you ever saw the movie Field of Dreams, there's a character in there called Moonlight Graham. And Moonlight Graham is a guy that got to, he wanted to be a professional baseball player and he got called up, but he never got to bat. And he wanted to bat just once in the major leagues. And Moonlight Graham was from Chisholm, Minnesota. And as it turns out, he didn't get to bat in the major leagues, but he went back to Chisholm and he became an eye doctor. And it pointed out in the movie that he was somebody who helped deal with the poor of his community. And Moonlight Graham and my grandfather were really good friends. And I got to meet Moonlight when I was a kid. And my grandfather was somebody who preached the gospel, but he engaged people's lives. But he was ordained minister in the Methodist Church. And the Methodists is a church that doctrinally they believe that it's possible for human beings to achieve perfection. And if you go talk to a bunch of old-line Methodists, they'll talk about the fact that they haven't sinned for 20 years or 25 years. They can think back to the last time that they sinned. And the Methodists are don't smoke, don't drink, and don't go with girls that do. And the Methodists are also anti-film, anti-cards. So my grandfather had never been to a movie. The first movie that he ended up going to was The Sound of Music. And he went in Minneapolis, and I think that he was worried that somebody was going to see him when he was entering the movie theater. But he was utterly blown away by the movie. And later in his life, he never played cards, but he played rook. And it was okay to play rook with him. And rook is a card game, but it doesn't have a deck of playing cards. And so the Methodists were a group that were saying that culture was something to be avoided. Culture was something that it was going to corrupt us. Culture was consistent with the idea of corruption. The Calvinists believed that culture could be redeemed and that everything in the world was made by Jesus and that everything could be remade by him. And so the Calvinists believed that everything could be redeemed by God. So they would say that it was perfectly fine to engage with culture so long as you were a mature Christian, so long as you could avoid being corrupted by it. Over the next several days, we're going to be looking at some different positions about Christ and culture. First one we're going to look at is Christ against culture. And it is the idea that's associated with the Mennonites primarily. But it's the idea that culture is inherently evil. It's something to be avoided. It's something, we're to be in this world, but we're not to be of the world. And to be of the world is to be engaged with the things of this world, and the things of this world are to be shunned. The second position we're going to look at is the Christ of culture. And it's the position that says that Jesus came and he redeemed culture. And so when Jesus came and he redeemed culture, culture became a good. Culture became an agent for good. That the only thing in the world that's sinful is sin itself. That the world is something that God made, and what God made is good. And so it's inherently good. Of course, we can corrupt it, but the idea is that culture is not to be feared. Culture is to be embraced. The third position we're going to look at is Christ in culture and paradox. And that's the idea that human Christians have no choice but to engage in culture. But we're going to have to so it's a Lutheran position, and Luther has this idea of sinning boldly. Luther's of the belief that you can come up in your life you're going to have decisions to make, and whatever decision you make is a sinful decision. So Luther says you need to sit back, count the cost of your decision, and make your decision, but you're going to have to sin boldly. And you're going to have to trust on God's forgiveness. So Luther believes that this world is a sinful place, and that it's a sinful place because humans have made it sinful. And because humans have made it sinful, it's not the case that we can get out of it. It's not the case that we can escape sin. It's the case that humans have made this world, and now we're going to have to lay in this world. And that's why he makes the case that there's sometimes that we're faced with nothing but sinful options. Christ in culture and synthesis. This is a belief of St. Thomas Aquinas. And what he argued was this, that reason, that there's reason, that God made reason. The reason can help us to connect ourselves to the creation. It can connect ourselves to God. But reason itself can't bring us to faith. So what he says is you have to have faith and reason. And so he doesn't believe that culture is necessarily sinful. He believes that if it's based on reason, culture can be good. And the fifth position we're going to look at is Christ, the transformer of culture. This is the idea that we inherit a world that's sinful, we inherit a culture that's sinful, but we are tasked with embracing the world and changing the world and bringing it under the lordship of Christ. And that we can be change agents in culture. So let me stop there. Do you have any questions? So for the rest of this day, we're going to look at Christ and the pagans. We're going to look at Christ and Aristotle and Christ and Plato. Aristotle and Plato are two Greek thinkers that lived before Christ, but the Christian church found them to be enormously helpful, and they've been enormously helpful to me to understand the world that we live in. And then tomorrow, we're going to be looking at these 5 different positions in much more detail. And Wednesday, we're going to look at American culture through the eyes of Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who came to America during the 19th century, and he wrote a book called Democracy in America, which I think is the most prophetic book that's ever been written about America, and I think that it stands the test of time to this day, and so I'll be explaining that. And then I'm going to end our time together with a sermon. So I'm going to send you off with a sermon at Wednesday at 4 o'clock. So let's take a break and come back in a few minutes, and we'll start with Plato and Aristotle. We'll start with Aristotle.